as human beings, there's qualities that are implicit in just being a human being. They're kind of, we're like pre-biologically wired for these implicit qualities. And in any moment, there's implicit maybe next steps that could happen, or
I think you've got it, Edwin.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay.
There's implicit next steps. One example that's nice is if you see a crooked picture on the wall, right? So I see some pictures on the wall behind you, and they look very straight, but let's say one of them was like this. And seeing the crooked picture gives us this feeling of offness or wrongness.
Mm-hmm.
And that feeling of offness has in it the knowing of, you know, I or someone else could walk across the room and straighten out that picture. So one of the things Gendlin is famous for saying is every bad feeling is potential energy for a more right way of being if you give it space. And the sense of the crooked picture on the wall is one metaphor that helps us understand that even feelings that we're having that are unpleasant, uneasy, fearful, or even very depressed or down, contain a kind of knowing of what would be needed, what would be the right next step.
Oh, I see. So it's that even if you're in pain, if you're feeling angry, or you have different types of anxiety or fear, that underneath that is sort of a next step or a knowing of what the solution would be to address that. So it's almost as if that problem feeling or that pain is like a source of its own resolution, in a sense, underneath it.
That's right.
That's
right. That's what I'm saying, and that's what we found. And so it's very interesting to really live that way, because in general, the culture in general tries to push away negative feelings, to control them, to, you know, handle or manage them somehow. And yet it turns out that if you turn toward them with a quality of inner empathy, like, hello, I'd like to get to know you better, there are steps of change that emerge. We kind of speak in general in the common culture about our feelings as if they're kind of unchangeable. You know, I have this fear of public speaking, or I have this anger at my brother, and as if it's some kind of piece of furniture that's always going to be there. But the word emotion points to the fact that every emotion is on its way to being something else. And yet we do experience emotions recurring in certain situations over and over again. So why is that? I believe it's because we're treating the emotions as if they're unchangeable. Now, you didn't mention in your introduction of me that my degree is in linguistics. I bring the study of language to the work I do in emotional healing. I call it the art of facilitative language. And one of the things I try to remind people, watch out for nouns. Notice the difference between my fear, okay, fear is a noun, and so just the fact that it's a noun makes it seem kind of unchangeable. What if we say instead, afraid? And I would add a little more language to that, and I would say something in me is afraid right now. And now we have a very different attitude toward what we're feeling than if we say, it's my fear.
So you're creating more of a space around it. It's like not this, I am this thing and it's fixed. It's that it's this I'm afraid, and it's this quality within me, and there's more space around it in that sense.
And in that exactly. And in that space, what has become now possible is curiosity. By the way, curiosity and empathy go together very well, don't they? And And I think curiosity is another very powerful force. If someone is attacking me verbally or is somehow holding a fixed position that I just can't understand, probably the first step I'm going to need in order to empathize with that person is to get curious, is to say to myself, there must be some good reason why that person thinks that's so important. I wonder what it is. Let me see if I can understand.
It comes up a lot. Oh, yeah. It comes up a lot in the work around empathy, the curiosity. For example, you're here in Berkeley, and at UC Berkeley, I interviewed, I can't remember her name, but she has a book, Jody Halpern. She has a book on empathy and health in medicine about, you know, the needing curiosity in medicine as a doctor, physician with patients, and it comes up a lot. So it's seems to be a core
empathy and curiosity linked to each other, and compassion, of course, too. But I think they, you know, I would just theorize they usually come in this order: first curiosity, then empathy, then compassion.
Oh, here's a question I do want to say. Are you complete with that thought, or because what I'm saying, I have a question about focusing, in the sense the empathy does not seem central to focusing. Like I've put empathy as this core foundational value and kind of organized around that value. And focusing, while empathy is mentioned, it doesn't seem to be central. And for example, you're saying, you know, what comes first, you know, curiosity, empathy. But I'm coming from the position of like mirror neurons, you know, the neuroscience, that we are in a constant empathic environment. So it's almost like, you know, we wouldn't even function as a society if we didn't have this ongoing empathy relationship. It's just that we're not being as good or effective at empathy as we could be. So it's kind of starting from that presence versus like we have no empathy and you do all these things and have empathy. So I just wondered about any thoughts around that.
Well,
there's a couple different things in that, but
no, I first of all, I love the position that empathy is already here. It's woven in to who we are and what we are as a human society, and that's completely consistent with what Gendlin says. He has a phrase, interaction first, by which he means that we're born into relationship. There's no time when we're not in interrelationship, and really that our bodies and our environment are not separate. And so where we are when we are in touch with ourselves is also in touch with what's around us, and especially other people. So yes, it's at the very heart of what we are as humans. And also, if focusing works at all, and it does, it works because we're tuning into something that's mutually felt, that's felt as a tuning in to what's here in a field, you might say. That's only beginning to be talked about in the focusing community. You hear most of the discussions being about a kind of self relationship. But it's been clear to me from the very start, and most people do understand, that we're tuning into a kind of shared field. So in my work, which is moving on a little bit from Gendlin, it's called inner relationship focusing. And so I especially emphasize that there's a relationship inwardly between the person as a whole self, I call self in presence, and something inside that feels bad, you might say. So we had, I'm angry, and then we have something in me is angry. And because of saying something in me is angry, there's a space, there's curiosity, and I am turning toward this place that's angry. Now, the next step of focusing would be to describe the way it feels in my body. But, you know, actually that is also empathy, because sensing and describing how something simply is right now is an empathic move instead of all the other things we could do instead, which is arguing with it, trying to get rid of it, being afraid of it, being afraid of what it means, and so on. So simply sensing and describing is actually an empathic move toward how it is feeling.
So what I'm hearing there is that there's like, you didn't use the word, but it's almost like a self-empathy, a feeling into oneself. And there's things that block maybe that feeling into oneself. And you mentioned a bunch, several of them, the blocking, or I can't remember which ones exactly you mentioned, but so that would that work in terms of a self-empathy, in terms of a word? Does that kind of fit? Or
yes, I saw on your website self-empathy was a term, and I would classify focusing as a self-empathy method.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that in my work of inner relationship focusing, we've put that self-empathy even more to the forefront. And so if you want to, I'll just show you the steps of focusing. The first is to pause and allow a body feeling to form, and then to turn toward it and describe it. And saying that that description is already an empathizing move. But then there's a deeper move, which is to sense how it's feeling from its point of view. And that's a very odd moment. I mean, I really surprise a lot of people when I teach that. I remember once a woman who said, "My throat is tight." And I said, "Well, so how does it feel?" And she said, "Well, it feels uncomfortable." And you can tell that when she says it feels uncomfortable, she's not empathizing with it.
Mm-hmm.
So
Cool.
I said to her, "Oh, okay, it feels uncomfortable to you. And would you be willing to sense how it itself is feeling?" And she was willing, and she paused, and she opened her eyes. She paused a moment and closed her eyes, and then opened her eyes with surprise and said, "Oh, it is scared." And so it is teachable, this move of empathy with the feelings we're having from their own point of view. And by the way, Gendlin calls these feelings felt sense. The felt sense is the forming of the body's felt experiencing at this moment. And he has an interesting story, a nice little story about what can happen and how things can really change when you give yourself this kind of empathy. He tells the story of a client that he had who had, she says, "I sabotage myself." She was a student in college. "I sabotage myself. When it comes time to turn in a paper, I pull back." All right. Now, you can imagine many conversations that could evolve from there, that a therapist and a client would discuss, better study strategies, or what were the childhood sources of this. But what he said instead was, maybe you can sense the pullback. The pullback, it's a funny way of talking, in order to make it something that can be sensed. And so then she was silent. And that's an odd thing to happen in therapy too, that people wouldn't just talk about their problems. She said, "Okay, yes, I feel it." And then she was silent. And she opened her eyes and she said, here's my notes here, "This is an all good place that would rather be hidden than come out and be tromped on." And the point is that by empathizing with the place in her that had not been handing in papers, it took a step. Everyone, including her, thought that was some kind of the bad guy, the saboteur inside. And by pausing and empathizing with its point of view, she was able to sense something completely surprising, completely different. It changed her whole body constellation. It's not just a new information. It's something new in the whole way the issue is held. She'll now live differently. Yeah, exactly. So this inner empathy leads to really new possibilities for life.
Okay, so let me just reflect what I'm getting here so far, is that you can feel into yourself, and you can feel different qualities within yourself. And you can find one of those qualities, and you can actually role play, in a sense, take on the characteristic. Like if I'm feeling a tightness within my throat, I can say, okay, I am the tightness in my throat. What is my experience as being the tightness in the throat? And have role play with different parts of myself in that way. Is that kind of along the...
Well, that's kind of surprising, and I'm really glad you shared, because it's not quite what I meant.
Okay, good.
So back to the story of the woman who could feel that her throat itself was scared. And what I hear you doing is trying to imagine, how did she do that? Did she do it by, do it by role playing her throat? And that's actually a little more complicated and not necessary at all. Because actually, we have the ability to empathize with something we feel inside us in the same way that we can empathize with someone sitting next to us. And if I'm sitting next to a friend who's not talking, I can still tell what mood the friend is. And I don't have to do that by imagining I'm the friend. I do it because, as we've already seen, we have that ability to know how someone else is feeling. It's like, imagine walking up, you have a really great joke, you had a great day, you want to share your joke with a friend, you knock on their door, they open the door, and like, oh, you can just see from their whole face, better not share the joke. So it happens instantly. I didn't have to role play being the friend.
I see. So in the tightness in the throat then, she is empathizing with that tightness in the throat. She's getting closer to it. She's feeling her way into the experience of it.
Yeah. She doesn't have to become it in order to do that.
I see.
In fact, that's why my work is called Inner Relationship. What she actually needs to do is feel that she's not it. That there is something there. That she stops saying, I'm tight or I'm scared, and starts saying, it's tight, it's scared. So the sense of a separation or a relationship with allows an inner empathy to happen. Yeah.
I see. Yes, I had an experience, maybe this is similar, is I do this freestyle dance here in Berkeley sometimes. And one time I was noticing like an anxiety within myself, like, oh, I'm feeling kind of anxious, and it's in the core part of myself. And, you know, I'll usually go and dance and move around and kind of avoid it or whatever. I said, no, I want to really get close to that anxiety. I want to really feel the anxiety. I want to get so close to it that it kind of opens up and I can feel the minute granular quality of that anxiety and in me. So I started moving, but I kept moving towards that. And it kept getting bigger, and actually then sort of metaphors started forming, like, oh, it feels like thousands of little knives, you know, kind of cutting away, and I'm going to get closer to that. And it was so interesting because it was, I got closer to it, and I got you just started feeling more awareness, and it's almost as if it just kind of disappeared. It was like, oh, it's gone, where'd it go? But it was like within about 5 or 6 seconds more, a new kind of anxiety. There was more like a cloud, a heavy cloud over me, kind of like a weight formed. It was like a cloud. I said, okay, I'm going to go to that. And I started moving towards that and had a similar experience, getting closer to it, and it just kind of dissolved. And doing a whole series of these, going from one anxiety or, you know, fear to the other, and keep going into it. So is that a little bit like what you're talking about? Is it's going towards it, getting closer to it, feeling your way into it, wanting to...
Yeah, it makes me happy what you're saying. I'm really happy about it. Actually, I use a method just like that if I've injured myself, and if there's a purely physical sensation that I just really want to help move forward and release. But anxiety has a meaningful component. And so, although I so respect what you did, I would differentiate focusing from what you did.
Okay.
And say that if I were you in that situation, I would have said hello to something in me that's anxious, and said, you know, I would like to feel you, but I wouldn't feel it by becoming it, by entering into it, I would feel it by letting it be felt somewhere in my body, maybe noticing where I feel it the most, and then describing that. And then I would ask what it's anxious about. What's got it anxious?
Mm-hmm.
But I might also first check the word anxious if that's actually the right word for it. So there's a kind of communication. It's not like it exactly talks, but it shows images. I think you said yours showed you images, and metaphors come, and yet so everything you said makes me happy, and it's included in what we do. But the one thing that you didn't say is you found out what was getting you so anxious.
I see. Uh-huh.
And there was an aha moment. Okay. And I even wonder, this is kind of daring of me, but I even wonder if you had done that, it might have really finished, so it wouldn't keep coming back.
I see.
Yeah.
So it's more of engaging in a relationship with it. Would that be more accurate? Right. Instead of me just moving through it and it kind of disappearing, I'm seeing it. I'm almost like I'm dialoguing with that feeling. Right. It's not necessarily speaking back, but it's showing parts of itself in the dialogue.
That's right.
And then underneath that, I'm gaining some kind of an insight, like what is that anxiety about, and what's the message it has for me, instead of just kind of moving through it.
And there'll be something surprising there. I mean, what we understand about interpersonal relationships is that when someone is heard, they relax, and then a new state emerges. And the same is true inwardly, is that when something inside us is heard, it no longer needs to feel the same way. And so there's what I tell my students is, if you're still feeling the feeling, there must be something about it that it feels has not been heard yet. And sure enough, if you go back, what hasn't been heard yet, something will emerge. And when what really needed to be heard comes, there is a physiological response, a relaxing, a relief, a deeper breath, and it doesn't return.